On April 15, 2026, 77 workers across two historic factory floors in Chisholm and Hibbing, Minnesota, were handed a sudden, irreversible death sentence. A legally mandated WARN notice informed them that the Minnesota twist drill facilities, the industrial bedrock of their community for over 7 decades, were shutting down forever. The executioner wasn't a struggling local owner or a bankrupt competitor. It was their parent company, Walter Surface Technologies. A Canadian industrial titan boasting operations in 7 countries and an estimated revenue pushing $250 million, Walter was actively celebrating its global expansions and championing the corporate slogan, "Well to the fullest." Yet at the exact same moment, the distant boardroom was quietly signing the paperwork to crush the livelihoods of 73 hourly laborers and 4 salaried engineers who had dedicated their lives to mastering the steel. The humming machines that once turned out 80,000 drill bits a day would soon be sold for scrap. How does a family-founded business, originally built on the noble promise of worker safety and uncompromised craftsmanship, mutate into a ruthless private equity machine? Why does an empire systematically devour the very heritage brands it claims to champion, leaving nothing but locked gates and hollowed-out communities in its wake? Welcome to the darkest corner of modern manufacturing, a place where multi-million-dollar buyouts are subsidized by the quiet suffering of small-town America. This is the tragic anatomy of a corporate takeover. This is the silent tragedy hidden behind the Walter Surface Technologies empire. In the early 1950s, the industrial landscape of North America was roaring to life with unprecedented momentum. The post-World War II economic boom had transformed cities into sprawling hubs of production, and factories became the beating heart of a rapidly expanding modern world. It was an era defined by steel, sweat, and the deafening symphony of heavy machinery. Amidst this backdrop of industrial optimism, a young entrepreneur named J. Walter Summers arrived in Canada. Armed with the rigorous precision of his German engineering background and an uncompromising work ethic, Summers did not merely see a booming market. He saw a critical gap in the way metalworkers approached their dangerous, grueling craft. In 1952, in the bustling industrial suburb of Pointe-Claire, Quebec, just outside the city limits of Montreal, he founded the J. Walter Company. From the very beginning, this was not envisioned as a sprawling, faceless corporate entity. It began as a modest, localized operation, born from the grit of the shop floor. Summers was a man who intimately understood the unforgiving language of metal fabrication. He knew the blinding heat of the welding torch, the bone-rattling vibration of the grinder, and the sheer physical toll that industrial labor extracted from the human body. He recognized that the men and women working in these environments were often treated as secondary to the machines they operated, forced to make do with subpar tools that broke easily and put their lives at risk. At the absolute core of the J. Walter Company was a philosophy that feels almost revolutionary when viewed through the lens of today's hyper-capitalist landscape. Summers operated under a simple but profound mandate: only the best is good enough. This was not concocted in a marketing boardroom. It was an unbreakable ethos forged in steel. Summers believed that a tool should be an extension of the worker's own hand, meticulously designed to increase productivity, yes, but never under any circumstances at the expense of safety or quality. When a blue-collar worker picked up a J. Walter product, they were not just holding a piece of equipment, they were holding a promise of survival and reliability in a hazardous environment. To achieve this, Summers spent his days not behind a mahogany desk, but out on the factory floors. He stood shoulder to shoulder with fabricators, observing their daily struggles, noting the inefficiencies of their abrasives, and listening to their frustrations. Every cutting wheel, every drill bit, and every grinding disc that eventually bore his name was heavily influenced by this direct human interaction. The company was literally built on a foundation of empathy for the laborer. They engineered solutions to withstand the brutal, punishing realities of heavy industry, earning their reputation one spark, one clean cut, and one safe shift at a time. This deeply human-centric approach extended far beyond product development. It permeated the very walls of the Pointe-Claire facility. In 1952, the modern concept of corporate culture was largely non-existent. Yet Summers intuitively built an industrial family. The machinists, the warehouse workers, and the administrative staff were not viewed as expendable labor overhead or numbers on a balance sheet. They were craftsmen, respected partners in a shared, noble mission. The company operated on a localized ecosystem of mutual loyalty. The business took care of its people, providing them with secure livelihoods and respect. And in return, those people poured their absolute dedication into building the J. Walter brand. It was an enterprise possessing something rare in the manufacturing world, a soul. For decades, this unyielding commitment to quality and human dignity served as the impenetrable bedrock of the enterprise. The J. Walter Company proved year after year that a business could achieve exceptional profitability while maintaining an unwavering moral compass. The foundation Summers poured in Pointe-Claire was solid, meant to last for generations, much like the heavy-duty industrial tools his company proudly manufactured. He believed he was building an indestructible legacy, a fortress of manufacturing integrity that would permanently protect both its workers and its customers. But a legacy is only as strong as the generation that inherits it. The principles of craftsmanship, safety, and profound worker respect are heavy burdens to carry, particularly when the ruthless winds of the global financial market begin to shift. The J. Walter Company was entirely built on the unbreakable, intimate bond between a creator and his workforce. Yet what J. Walter Summers could never have predicted in the modest confines of his 1952 office was how perfectly his localized, human-first empire would eventually be packaged, priced, and sold. He laid a foundation of solid, unyielding steel, completely unaware that 70 years later, it would be systematically melted down by an entirely different kind of machinery. A cold, calculated financial system where loyalty is the first expense to be cut. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the skylines of North America were stretching higher, and the highways were pushing further. It was an era of colossal infrastructure, a time when cities were quite literally being forged from steel and concrete. To keep pace with this explosive growth, the manufacturing industry required tools that could endure punishing, non-stop production cycles. The modest enterprise J. Walter Summers had built in Pointe-Claire was perfectly positioned to answer this call. The company was about to enter a multi-decade golden age, transforming from a respected local supplier into an undisputed titan of the metalworking world. The catalyst for this meteoric rise came in the form of a single, revolutionary product, the zip cut. Before its introduction, cutting thick steel was a notoriously slow and hazardous process. Traditional abrasive wheels were thick, inefficient, and prone to catastrophic shattering if a worker applied the wrong angle or too much pressure. Walter's engineering team tore up the standard playbook. They developed a cutting wheel that was remarkably thin, yet reinforced with high-tensile fiberglass webs. On the factory floor, the zip cut was nothing short of a revelation. When a fabricator lowered the grinder, the wheel bit into heavy-gauge steel with a high-pitched, aggressive whine, throwing a brilliant shower of orange sparks. It sliced through hardened metal like a hot knife through butter, leaving a perfectly clean edge without binding or overheating. It wasn't just faster, it was drastically safer. The zip cut didn't just capture market share, it completely redefined industry standards, becoming the generic trademark for cutting wheels across job sites from Montreal to the American Midwest. With innovation driving unprecedented revenue, the company underwent a natural evolution. As J. Walter Summers aged, the mantle of leadership was passed to the second generation. Pierre Summers took the helm, inheriting not just a profitable balance sheet, but the heavy moral responsibility of his father's vision. Pierre was ambitious. He saw no reason why the Walter standard of excellence should be confined to Canadian borders. Under his guidance, the company launched an aggressive, yet highly calculated international expansion. They established footholds in the United States, Europe, and eventually Latin America, officially rebranding as Walter Surface Technologies to reflect their global footprint and broadening catalog of chemical and mechanical solutions. Yet even as the company scaled into an international powerhouse, Pierre Summers fiercely protected the family-centric culture that his father had established. In the 1980s and 1990s, while other corporations were beginning to outsource manufacturing and slashed benefits to inflate quarterly earnings, Walter Surface Technologies doubled down on its commitment to the blue-collar worker. This commitment birthed the Walter Safety Seminars, an initiative that would become the beating heart of the brand's golden era. Walter didn't just ship boxes of grinders and drill bits. They deployed highly trained experts directly onto the shop floors of their clients. These instructors, often former tradesmen themselves, would gather dozens of grease-stained welders and machinists during their shifts to teach them the science of abrasives. They demonstrated how to inspect a wheel for microfractures, the exact angle to hold a grinder to prevent kickback, and the lethal physics of what happens when a tool is pushed past its structural limit. Over the decades, Walter's Safety Seminars trained tens of thousands of industrial workers worldwide, completely free of charge. It was a staggering logistical expense, but the company viewed it as a sacred duty. They were saving fingers, preserving eyesight, and preventing fatalities. In return, the working class rewarded Walter with a fierce, almost fanatical brand loyalty. To the men and women sweating in the shipyards, the foundries, and the fabrication shops, Walter was not just a vendor, they were a partner in survival. By the late 1990s, Walter Surface Technologies had achieved a rare, almost mythical status in the corporate world. It was a massive, highly lucrative multinational enterprise that still possessed the warm, beating heart of a family business. Employees celebrated 20, 30, and 40-year anniversaries with the company. The factories hummed with pride, turning out premium products that commanded top dollar in the market. They had seemingly solved the ultimate capitalist puzzle, achieving phenomenal financial success without sacrificing human dignity. But this very success was secretly laying the groundwork for a devastating future. The company's balance sheets were immaculate, their profit margins were exceptional, and their brand equity was virtually untouchable. In the cloistered, high-rise boardrooms of the global financial sector, where businesses are viewed not as human ecosystems, but as abstract data points, Walter Surface Technologies began to emit a blinding radar signature. As the new millennium approached, the business landscape was fundamentally mutating. A new breed of financial predator was rising to prominence: the private equity firm. These entities cared nothing for legacy, safety seminars, or generational loyalty. They cared only for maximum value extraction. Walter Surface Technologies had spent half a century building a fortress of quality, believing it would protect them forever. They did not realize that their immense, carefully cultivated value had just painted a massive target on their backs, drawing the gaze of sharks who were perfectly willing to tear the family empire apart to feast on the profits. By the year 2018, the global economic landscape had fundamentally transformed. The post-war industrial boom that had birthed the J. Walter Company was a distant memory, replaced by the hyper-financialized reality of the 21st century. In this new era, companies were rarely valued solely on the tangible quality of their products or the welfare of their workforce. Instead, they were evaluated through the cold, uncompromising lens of potential return on investment. A business was no longer a living ecosystem, it was a financial instrument. And in the eyes of Bay Street and Wall Street, Walter Surface Technologies was a severely under-optimized asset just waiting to be harvested. For decades, the company's massive profitability had been achieved organically, driven by relentless innovation and deep-rooted customer loyalty. But organic growth is slow, and slow growth is the mortal enemy of modern private equity. Behind closed doors, the pressures of succession, global competition, and the sheer overwhelming scale of the enterprise began to fracture the foundation of the family-owned empire. In September 2018, the seismic shift occurred. The announcement rippled through the manufacturing sector. OnCap, the mid-market private equity platform of the massive Onyx Corporation, had acquired a majority stake in Walter Surface Technologies. In the highly polished press releases distributed to Business Wire services, the language was carefully sanitized. The transaction was framed not as a takeover, but as a strategic partnership. Executives spoke breathlessly of unlocking value, leveraging synergies, and accelerating global expansion. Pierre Summers retained a minority stake and the title of chairman, providing a comforting, familiar face to the market. To the untrained eye, it looked like the logical next step for a growing multinational. But in the ruthless, unsentimental calculus of high finance, a majority stake means absolute dictatorial control. The moment the ink dried on the acquisition documents, the fundamental DNA of Walter Surface Technologies was irrevocably rewritten. Private equity firms do not buy manufacturing companies to preserve their heritage. They operate on a strict, predictable life cycle. Acquire a healthy target, aggressively restructure its operations to maximize short-term cash flow, inflate its valuation through rapid acquisitions, and then sell it off or take it public within a 5 to 7 year window for a massive profit. The private equity model is fundamentally incompatible with the generational patience that built the Walter brand. For the veteran employees at the Pointe Claire headquarters, the change was not an overnight massacre, but a creeping, insidious fog. The old guard who had spent decades answering to engineers and tradesmen suddenly found themselves answering to a newly installed layer of financial analysts and portfolio managers. These were men and women in tailored suits who had never set foot on a noisy, spark-filled factory floor, yet they now held absolute authority over every operational decision. The family business was dead. It had been swallowed whole by an abstract financial machine. The cultural erosion began quietly, masked behind the sterile vocabulary of corporate efficiency. When a private equity firm takes the reins, the paramount metric of success shifts instantly from product excellence to EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Every single facet of the company was placed under a financial microscope to see where margins could be squeezed. The mandate set by J. Walter Summers, "Only the best is good enough," was subtly but firmly replaced by a new unspoken directive: good enough to sell at the highest possible margin. The human-centric philosophy that had defined the golden age became an immediate liability in the eyes of the new board. Why spend heavily on premium raw materials when a cheaper imported substitute could perform adequately enough to pass inspection? Why maintain a surplus of seasoned, highly paid technicians when their roles could be consolidated or outsourced? The famed Walter Safety Seminars, once considered a sacred duty to the working class, were suddenly scrutinized by accountants who viewed them solely as non-revenue generating expenditures. The localized, familial loyalty that had kept turnover at record lows was systematically dismantled. Longtime managers who possessed decades of irreplaceable institutional knowledge about abrasives and metallurgy were increasingly pressured to meet impossible new key performance indicators, KPIs. Those who pushed back, citing a decline in quality or worker morale, were quickly categorized as resistant to change and quietly phased out, replaced by compliant executives who excelled at creating immaculate PowerPoint presentations. The atmosphere within the company's offices grew heavy with paranoia and exhaustion. The focus was no longer on serving the fabricator. It was entirely consumed by serving the shareholder. The deep emotional connection between the creator and the workforce was severed, leaving behind a hollow, metric-obsessed bureaucracy. Yet simply cutting costs was not enough to satisfy the aggressive growth targets demanded by OnCap's investors. To achieve the massive valuation spikes required for a future sale, organic growth had to be abandoned in favor of something much faster and far more dangerous. The private equity playbook dictated that Walter Surface Technologies had to mutate from a manufacturer into an apex predator. Armed with OnCap's massive war chest, the newly restructured board of directors looked out across the North American industrial landscape. They were no longer interested in just selling the best cutting wheels or drill bits. They were preparing to buy the very companies that made them. The era of craftsmanship had officially ended. The era of corporate cannibalism was about to begin. The stage was set for a multi-year shopping spree that would artificially inflate the empire while secretly hollowing out its core. In the high-stakes arena of private equity, there is a fundamental, unspoken axiom: if you are not growing aggressively, you are dying. For Walter Surface Technologies, organic growth, the slow, meticulous process of engineering new tools and winning over individual fabricators, was no longer sufficient to satisfy the towering return expectations of OnCap. Between 2020 and 2024, the company was fundamentally weaponized. Armed with a massive influx of institutional capital, Walter transformed from a proud heritage manufacturer into an insatiable corporate accumulator. This was the era of the acquisition illusion. The strategy was executed with ruthless military precision. Instead of fighting competitors for market share on the factory floor, Walter simply bought them out from the boardroom. In 2020, they acquired Drillco, a major player in industrial cutting tools. The following year, they absorbed Allegro Industries, rapidly expanding their footprint into the lucrative safety equipment sector. By 2023, they had swallowed PushCorp, bringing robotic and automated finishing solutions under their ever-expanding umbrella. On paper, and in the glowing press releases distributed to the financial media, this looked like the glorious evolution of a modern industrial titan. The corporate narrative was flawless, speaking endlessly of synergies, comprehensive solutions, and building an unparalleled global ecosystem for metalworkers. Walter painted a picture of a benevolent giant, bringing independent brands together to create a stronger, unified future. But the most fateful of these acquisitions, and the one that would ultimately expose the cold, mechanical nature of this new empire, occurred in December of 2021. Deep in the Iron Range of Minnesota, spread across the frigid, hard-working towns of Chisholm and Hibbing, lay Minnesota Twist Drill, MTD. Much like the original J. Walter Company, MTD was a sacred legacy institution. Founded in 1952, the exact same year J. Walter Summers opened his doors in Quebec, MTD had spent nearly 7 decades mastering the complex, high-stakes production of high-speed steel drill bits. They were the indisputable lifeblood of their local economy. For the tightly knit communities of Chisholm and Hibbing, the factory was more than just a place of employment. It was a multi-generational anchor. Fathers, sons, and grandsons worked the exact same lines, tending to the massive, roaring machines that churned out up to 80,000 precision drill bits in a single day. When Walter Surface Technologies swooped in to purchase MTD in late 2021, the anxiety on the factory floors was palpable. Corporate buyouts inherently breed fear among the working class, but the executives from Canada, polished and highly trained in public relations, arrived with a comforting, familiar script. They invoked the shared 1952 heritage of the two companies. They praised the unparalleled craftsmanship of the Minnesotan workforce. The official rhetoric promised that MTD would continue to operate as usual, serving proudly as the primary North American manufacturing hub for Walter's newly expanded cutting tools division. To the machinists and engineers in Chisholm and Hibbing, it felt as though they had been granted a rare reprieve in a brutal industry. They breathed a collective sigh of relief. They were told they were now part of the global Walter family. It was a masterful, heartbreaking illusion. What the workers in Minnesota and across the other newly acquired subsidiaries did not yet understand was the hidden calculus of a private equity roll-up. When a financial entity buys a legacy brand, they are rarely buying the physical factory, the aging machinery, or the people who operate it. They are buying the company's customer list, its established distribution channels, its patents, and its hard-earned market share. Behind the scenes, the integration process was entirely devoid of any familial sentiment. The moment the acquisitions were finalized, Walter's corporate headquarters began the methodical process of extracting value. The acquired brand's distribution networks were seamlessly integrated into Walter's global supply chain. The customer databases were quietly absorbed. The unique intellectual property was transferred up the corporate ladder. Meanwhile, the physical factories that had built these respected brands were silently placed under suffocating pressure. The new parent company began imposing draconian financial targets on the local management teams. Facilities like MTD were suddenly required to meet impossible production quotas while simultaneously dealing with slashed budgets for maintenance, replacement parts, and raw materials. The PR narrative of synergy was, in reality, a deliberate strategy of starvation. By stripping the newly acquired companies of their independent sales forces and administrative autonomy, Walter ensured that these local factories were entirely dependent on the corporate mothership for survival. Throughout the early 2020s, the business press hailed Walter Surface Technologies as a massive financial triumph. Their revenue was skyrocketing, their portfolio of brands was unmatched, and their valuation was climbing to unprecedented heights. They had successfully built the illusion of an invincible industrial empire. But beneath the glossy veneer of the corporate brochures, the foundation was rapidly decaying. The company was no longer a creator of value. It had become an extractor of it. It was a balloon expanding at a terrifying rate, filled not with the solid steel of its heritage, but with the precarious, hot air of leveraged debt and broken promises. The stage was perfectly set. The empire had consumed everything it needed to inflate its worth. The assets were secured. The distribution lines were conquered. Now the boardroom was quietly preparing to discard the heavy human remnants it had left behind. By 2024, the glittering facade of the newly expanded Walter Surface Technologies was beginning to crack under the immense, crushing weight of private equity expectations. The multi-million-dollar acquisitions had successfully inflated the company's valuation, creating a spectacular illusion of growth for the financial press. However, behind the closed doors of the factories and regional offices, a profound and devastating transformation was taking place. The business had not just changed its operational strategy, it had fundamentally altered its soul. The geographic and psychological disconnect between the corporate headquarters and the factory floors grew into an unbridgeable chasm. In the sleek, climate-controlled boardrooms of Montreal, the newly installed executive team, heavily influenced by ONCAP's financial architects, spoke a language entirely foreign to the manufacturing world. They communicated in the sterile dialect of synergy realization, margin optimization, and lean resource allocation. They were men and managers who had spent their entire careers analyzing spreadsheets, yet they now held absolute dictatorial power over the production of high-speed steel and industrial abrasives. To the men and women actually working the lines in places like Chisholm and Hibbing, this disconnect was not just frustrating, it was visceral. The workers who had spent decades mastering the dangerous, precise art of metalworking suddenly found themselves answering to middle managers who had never touched a grinder, never smelled burning steel, and never felt the bone-deep exhaustion of a 12-hour shift. The generational wisdom of the machinists was no longer respected as an asset. It was viewed as an obstacle to automated efficiency. Internal communications and employee testimonies from this period paint a grim picture of a culture in freefall. Workers began describing the once beloved company as a cold, soulless machine. The familial warmth that J. Walter Summers had so carefully cultivated was systematically eradicated, replaced by an atmosphere of surveillance and paranoia. The unwritten social contract of manufacturing, loyalty in exchange for security and respect, was torn to shreds. The most immediate and painful manifestation of this culture clash was the aggressive slashing of employee compensation and benefits. The annual performance bonuses, which for decades had been a reliable staple of the working-class families dependent on the factories, were abruptly restructured. They were now tied to a labyrinth of impossible, globally averaged metrics designed specifically so they could never be achieved. The small, localized gestures of appreciation, the holiday gatherings, the milestone anniversary recognitions, the discretionary funds for shop floor improvements, were all redlined by corporate accountants as unnecessary overhead. The workers were explicitly told that these austerity measures were necessary to ensure the company's competitive edge in a challenging global market. Yet on the very same day a foreman might be denied a minimal budget increase to fix a failing ventilation system, Walter Surface Technologies' marketing department would launch yet another lavish, high-budget digital campaign promoting their weld-to-the-fullest lifestyle brand. The dissonance between the public relations narrative and the grim, suffocating reality of the shop floor was deafening. The workers realized they were no longer partners in a shared industrial mission. They had been downgraded to disposable liabilities on a balance sheet. As 2024 bled into 2025, the cultural rot evolved into an operational crisis. The mandate from the private equity board was relentless: increase output, maximize cash flow, and minimize all capital expenditures. This impossible triangulation created a brutal pressure cooker inside the legacy facilities that Walter had acquired. At the Minnesota Twist drill plants, the tension was unbearable. The factory was required to meet staggering production quotas to feed Walter's massive new global distribution network. Yet the resources required to meet those quotas were systematically starved. Aging machinery, some of which had been faithfully churning out drill bits, since the late 20th century, was pushed far beyond its safe operational limits. When a critical component broke down, local management could no longer simply authorize a repair. Instead, they were forced into a humiliating, weeks-long bureaucratic maze, submitting requisition forms to financial officers thousands of miles away who would routinely reject or delay the purchase to protect quarterly margins. The burden of this manufactured dysfunction fell entirely on the shoulders of the blue-collar workforce. Machinists were forced to cannibalize parts from older machines just to keep the primary lines running. Safety protocols, once the sacred religion of the Walter brand during its golden age, were quietly compromised in the desperate rush to meet the punishing key performance indicators, KPIs. Foremen, many of whom had grown up in the same neighborhoods as their crews, were strong-armed by corporate HR into issuing formal disciplinary warnings to veteran workers for missing production targets that were mathematically impossible to hit with failing equipment. The psychological toll was devastating. The factory floor, once a place of deep, multi-generational pride, became a battleground of anxiety and exhaustion. The men and women of Chisholm and Hibbing were working harder, faster, and longer than ever before, yet they were constantly told by anonymous emails from Montreal that they were underperforming. By late 2025, the friction within Walter Surface Technologies had reached a critical mass. The empire was massive, bloated by its frantic string of acquisitions, but it was bleeding from the inside. The private equity playbook had successfully extracted the company's heritage and stripped its assets. But in doing so, it had completely destroyed the human engine that actually powered the business. The synergies promised to the shareholders were failing to materialize at the necessary scale, and the massive debt accumulated during the 2023 buying spree was beginning to cast a long, dark shadow over the balance sheets. The investors at OnCap were growing impatient. The era of artificial expansion had reached its absolute limit. The spreadsheets were no longer balancing, and in the cold, unsentimental world of high finance, when the numbers fail to align, the system demands a sacrifice. The workers sweating on the floors of the legacy plants did not know it yet, but the relentless pressure they were feeling was not just poor management. It was the unmistakable tremor before a collapse. The soulless machine had finished acquiring. It was now preparing to purge. The dawn of 2026 did not bring the triumphant global synergy that Walter Surface Technologies had promised its investors. Instead, it brought the inescapable gravity of financial reality. The multi-year acquisition spree, fueled by the aggressive capital of OnCap, had successfully masked the company's internal rot behind a facade of expanding revenue. But in the unforgiving realm of private equity, debt eventually matures, and the bill always comes due. The sprawling, Frankenstein-like empire that Walter had stitched together was buckling under its own administrative weight and the staggering interest payments of its leveraged buyouts. In the high-rise boardrooms of Montreal and Toronto, the patience of the portfolio managers had officially evaporated. The projected profit margins were missing their targets, and the organic growth of the core business had stagnated, choked by years of underinvestment and the systematic destruction of the company's foundational culture. The financial algorithms that now governed Walter Surface Technologies calculated a chilling conclusion. If revenue could no longer be artificially inflated through acquisitions, then profitability had to be manufactured through violent, widespread amputations. The era of corporate expansion was abruptly terminated. The era of the Great Purge had begun. The first heavy blow did not land in North America, but across the globe, serving as a terrifying warning siren for the rest of the empire. In early 2026, the corporate guillotine dropped on the company's operations in Oceania. With bloodless efficiency, Walter suddenly announced the closure of its long-standing regional offices and distribution hubs in Australia and New Zealand. Entire teams, sales representatives, logistics coordinators, and administrative staff who had spent years building the brand's presence in the Pacific were unceremoniously terminated. The rationale provided in the internal corporate memos was as sterile as it was predictable. Strategic realignment, consolidation of global assets, and optimizing the supply chain footprint. But to the remaining employees worldwide, the translation was crystal clear. The company was hemorrhaging, and the executive board was perfectly willing to sever healthy limbs to protect the financial organs of the parent company. The illusion of the global Walter family was shattered overnight. It was now a brutal game of survival, and every single facility was being evaluated not on its history, but on its immediate liquidation value. As the shockwaves of the Oceania closures rippled across the Pacific, a suffocating atmosphere of dread settled over Walter's North American manufacturing sites. Nowhere was this psychological terror more palpable than inside the Minnesota twist drill facilities in Chisholm and Hibbing. For months, the veteran workers had been forced to navigate the impossible demands of corporate management, struggling to meet quotas with failing machinery and slashed budgets. But in the early spring of 2026, the subtle, agonizing signs of a total systemic withdrawal began to manifest. The signs were not announced. They were felt in the sudden, eerie silences of the supply chain. Requisitions for essential raw materials, like premium high-speed steel and specialized coolants, were suddenly delayed indefinitely by the procurement office in Canada. Scheduled maintenance for the heavy grinding machines was canceled without explanation. Then came the most ominous indicator of all: the diversion of orders. Floor managers in Minnesota began to notice that massive, lucrative contracts that had historically been fulfilled by the Chisholm and Hibbing plants were being quietly rerouted to overseas manufacturing partners or newer, cheaper automated facilities within the Walter portfolio. The workers of the Iron Range are a notoriously perceptive breed. They possess a deep, intuitive understanding of the industrial life cycle, and they know the smell of a dying factory. When corporate executives from Montreal suddenly arrive for unannounced site audits, walking the floor with clipboards, refusing to make eye contact with the machinists, and intensely measuring the square footage of the warehouse spaces, the terrible truth crystallized. The executives were not there to figure out how to save the plant. They were taking inventory for the undertaker. A profound, agonizing tension gripped the local communities. Families who had relied on the MTD plants since 1952 found themselves trapped in a state of paralyzing uncertainty. They were going to work every day, pouring their sweat and expertise into building world-class tools, fully aware that the distant architects of their fate had already determined their obsolescence. They were no longer valued employees. They had been mathematically categorized as redundant overhead. The shadow of the private equity reaper had officially fallen over the Iron Range, and the crosshairs were locked directly onto the beating heart of Minnesota's manufacturing legacy. The stage was set for a tragedy of devastating proportions. To understand the sheer gravity of what was destroyed in the spring of 2026, one must first understand the ground upon which it was built. Northern Minnesota's Mesabi Iron Range is not merely a geographic location, it is an industrial crucible. The twin cities of Chisholm and Hibbing were carved out of the freezing, unforgiving earth by generations of miners, steelworkers, and machinists. This is a place where the winters are brutal, the work is intensely physical, and a person's worth is measured by the calluses on their hands and the loyalty they show to their neighbors. At the very center of this tight-knit, blue-collar ecosystem stood Minnesota Twist Drill, MTD. Founded in 1952, in a poetic but tragic parallel to the J. Walter Company's own genesis, MTD was the undisputed anchor of the local economy. For nearly 3/4 of a century, the sprawling brick and steel facilities were a cathedral of American manufacturing. The air inside was perpetually thick with the metallic tang of cutting fluid and the sharp scent of hot iron. MTD did not just make tools, they engineered high-speed steel drill bits of such uncompromising quality that they became the standard for heavy industry across the continent. At its operational zenith, the floors hummed with a fierce rhythmic energy, churning out a staggering 80,000 precision drill bits every single day. But MTD's true value was never measured in daily production quotas. It was measured in generations. It was entirely common to walk the factory floor and find a father and son operating adjacent grinding stations, or to speak to a foreman whose grandfather had helped pour the building's original concrete foundation. The 77 workers who kept the lines moving, 73 hourly union laborers and 4 salaried engineers, were not just colleagues. They were a family bound by shared sweat and a profound localized pride. When the factory whistle blew at the end of a shift, those workers went home to the same neighborhoods, attended the same churches, and spent their hard-earned paychecks at the same local hardware stores and diners. MTD was the economic heart-pumping lifeblood into Chisholm and Hibbing. When Walter Surface Technologies acquired MTD in late 2021, the corporate executives from Canada arrived on the Iron Range draped in the warm, reassuring language of partnership. They stood before the veteran machinists and promised that the Minnesota facilities would be the shining crown jewel of Walter's expanding North American empire. They leveraged the shared 1952 heritage of both companies to build immediate trust. The workers, deeply relieved that they hadn't been bought out by a faceless conglomerate intent on immediate liquidation, believed the narrative. They welcomed the Walter family into their home. They did not realize they had just invited a parasite into their bloodstream. The destruction of Minnesota Twist Drill was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing asphyxiation. The private equity architects at OnCap, operating through the Walter boardroom, had never intended to nurture the Iron Range facilities. They had purchased MTD strictly to acquire its prestigious customer base, its established market share, and its distribution channels. Once those vital assets were seamlessly integrated into the parent company's global network, the physical factories in Minnesota were quietly transitioned from strategic assets to expendable liabilities. Throughout 2024 and 2025, the 77 workers in Chisholm and Hibbing were subjected to a masterclass in corporate starvation. The parent company imposed draconian production targets, demanding that the Minnesota plants supply a massive, newly expanded global market. Yet simultaneously, Walter's financial officers slashed the local operating budgets to the bone. The veteran machinists were forced to perform miracles daily, nursing aging, heavy-duty equipment past the point of mechanical failure because requests for replacement parts were routinely denied or infinitely delayed by accountants in Montreal. The psychological torment of this period was profound. The workers knew exactly how to make the best drill bits in the world, but they were being systematically handcuffed by a management structure that cared only about squeezing the last possible drop of EBITDA from the aging machinery. Morale plummeted as the once proud factory floor deteriorated into a stressful, hazardous environment. The local foreman pleaded with corporate headquarters, sending desperate reports detailing the failing equipment and the unsustainable pressure on the workforce. Their warnings were met with deafening silence. The algorithms governing Walter Surface Technologies had already categorized the Minnesota plants as mathematically obsolete. By early 2026, the Walter empire was choking on its own debt, and the mandate for a global purge had been issued. The final decision to execute Minnesota Twist Drill was made in a climate-controlled boardroom thousands of miles away, entirely devoid of human context. There were no machinists in that room. There were no representatives from Chisholm or Hibbing. There was only a glowing spreadsheet and a group of portfolio managers tasked with artificially inflating the company's bottom line. They looked at the numbers: 73 hourly workers, 4 salaried employees, 2 aging buildings, and a heavy operational overhead. By shutting down the Minnesota plants, shifting the remaining machinery to cheaper, non-unionized automated facilities, and relying entirely on imported inventory, they could instantly erase a massive line item of expense. The fact that they were severing the economic jugular of 2 historic American towns and destroying 77 families' livelihoods did not factor into the financial modeling. It was a cold, perfectly sterile calculation. With the casual stroke of a pen, the executives in Canada signed the death warrant for a 74-year-old American institution. The tragedy of the Iron Range was sealed, setting the stage for a devastating spring morning that the workers of Chisholm and Hibbing would never forget. The morning of Wednesday, April 15, 2026, broke over the Minnesota Iron Range just as it had for thousands of mornings before. The spring air was still sharp with the lingering chill of a brutal Midwestern winter. In Chisholm and Hibbing, the early shift workers arrived before the sun fully cleared the horizon, clutching thermoses of dark coffee, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel of the parking lots. Inside the Minnesota Twist Drill facilities, the massive overhead lights flickered to life, and the familiar, deafening roar of heavy machinery began its daily crescendo. For the first few hours, it was just another Wednesday. Sparks flew from the grinding stations, cutting fluid washed over hot steel, and the metallic scent of industrial production filled the air. Then the rhythm was abruptly broken. Midway through the morning, the heavy machines were ordered to spin down. Supervisors, their faces pale and drawn, walked through the aisles signaling for the operators to kill the power. The sudden absence of noise was unnatural, a heavy, suffocating silence that immediately triggered a primal anxiety among the workforce. The entire staff, every machinist, every warehouse loader, every engineer, was instructed to gather on the main concrete floor. Waiting for them was a small contingent of corporate human resources representatives, flanked by local managers who looked as though they had not slept in days. In their hands were stacks of crisp, white paper. There were no projection screens, no optimistic PowerPoint presentations about global synergies, and no speeches about the Walter family. There was only the clinical, inescapable reality of the law. The representatives began distributing the documents. It was a WARN notice, the worker adjustment and retraining notification. Mandated by federal law, it is the document a company files when it is executing a mass layoff or a total plant closure. The language on the paper was sanitized, drafted by corporate attorneys in a distant high-rise, entirely devoid of empathy. It stated that the operations at both the Chisholm and Hibbing facilities would be permanently ceased. In an instant, the livelihoods of 77 people were erased. 73 hourly union laborers, the men and women whose physical toll had literally shaped the company's product, and 4 salaried engineers were handed a death sentence for their careers. There was no negotiation. There was no buyout offer for the community to save the plant. The decision had been finalized mathematically, signed off by the Walter Surface Technologies Board of Directors weeks prior, and kept in absolute secrecy until this exact moment. The psychological whiplash on the factory floor was violent. Grown men, their faces smeared with the black dust of high-speed steel, stared at the legal documents in pure, uncomprehending shock. Decades of flawless attendance, injured knuckles, and profound loyalty had been reduced to a generic paragraph terminating their employment. Yet the true cruelty of April 15, 2026, lay in the grotesque digital contrast occurring at that exact same hour. While 77 workers in Minnesota were quietly weeping or staring blankly into the void of unemployment, the marketing department at Walter Surface Technologies headquarters was fully operational. Across corporate LinkedIn accounts and industry social media pages, flawlessly edited videos were being published. They featured pristine, smiling models holding Walter abrasives, proudly trumpeting the brand's global expansion under the aggressive banner of "Weld to the fullest." The parent company was actively celebrating its market dominance, aggressively soliciting new investors, completely insulated from the human wreckage it had just authorized on the Iron Range. Once the WARN notices were distributed, the finality of the situation took physical form. Corporate protocol dictated that when a manufacturing facility is condemned, production does not simply wind down, it is abruptly severed. The workers were not asked to finish their shifts. They were instructed to gather their personal belongings and vacate the premises. The process of dismantling a 74-year-old industrial ecosystem is a profoundly physical and deeply emotional trauma. The workers returned to their stations not to operate them, but to pack them away. Heavy steel toolboxes, some of which had been passed down from fathers to sons and covered in decades of faded union stickers, were snapped shut. Lockers were emptied of winter coats, family photographs, and safety gear. The most agonizing moments occurred when the master breakers were thrown. One by one, the massive electrical panels that fed the production lines were killed. The hydraulic presses hissed as they lost pressure. The massive exhaust fans ground to a halt. As the power was systematically cut to different zones of the Chisholm and Hibbing plants, the buildings grew colder and darker. The humming, vibrating life force of the factories, a heartbeat that had pounded relentlessly since the Truman administration, was flatlining. For the veteran machinists, the silence was agonizing. A factory is not just a building. For those who spend their lives inside, it is a living entity. They knew every groan of the steel, every quirk of the conveyor belts, and every draft in the loading bays. Leaving the floor felt like abandoning a comrade on a battlefield. Several workers lingered near their idle machines, running their calloused hands over the cold steel casings one last time, an unspoken goodbye to the tools that had paid their mortgages and put their children through school. Slowly, the 77 employees filed out through the heavy steel exit doors, carrying their toolboxes into the harsh midday light of the Minnesota spring. They gathered in the gravel parking lots, lingering near their pickup trucks, unsure of what to do next. There was anger, yes, but mostly there was a profound, hollow grief. They hugged one another, trading quiet promises to keep in touch, though everyone knew the tight-knit fabric of their daily lives had been permanently torn apart. Behind them, local management and hired security began the grim task of locking down the facilities. The heavy rolling gates of the loading docks were chained. The perimeter fences were secured. In a matter of hours, Minnesota Twist Drill had been transformed from a cathedral of American manufacturing into a massive, silent tomb of industrial history. The parent company had successfully executed its private equity mandate. Walter Surface Technologies had eliminated its overhead, appeased the algorithms of its investors, and fortified its balance sheet. But as the sun set over the Iron Range that evening, casting long, dark shadows over the chained gates of Chisholm and Hibbing, the true cost of that financial victory was left standing out in the cold. The empire had secured its margins, but in doing so, it had finally, irrevocably, extinguished its own soul. The tragedy of Walter Surface Technologies is not merely the story of an isolated factory closure or a localized economic downturn. It serves as a terrifyingly perfect case study of modern industrial capitalism, a system where the financial map has completely replaced the physical territory. In the beginning, J. Walter Summers built an empire on the fundamental, unbreakable belief that a tool should protect and empower the worker who wields it. It was a philosophy of tangible creation, forged in steel, sweat, and profound mutual respect. But over the span of 70 years, that noble enterprise was slowly digested by a financial apparatus that values extraction over creation. Today, the Walter brand continues to exist. On paper, it boasts a massive global footprint, an immaculate corporate website, and a lucrative portfolio of acquired subsidiaries. Yet the authentic soul that animated it, the generational wisdom and pride of the machinists in places like Chisholm and Hibbing, has been irrevocably extinguished. The heavy machines at Minnesota Twist Drill are silent, sold for scrap or shipped to automated, non-unionized facilities, leaving behind a hollowed-out community that spent 3/4 of a century building the very reputation that private equity so ruthlessly monetized. The ultimate lesson here is as cold as the high-speed steel these men and women once milled. In the era of leveraged buyouts and aggressive corporate roll-ups, survival is rarely determined by the quality of your craftsmanship. The modern financial system does not reward those who build the best products. It rewards those who are most efficient at moving the numbers on a spreadsheet, even if it means permanently severing the human heart of the enterprise. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden human costs of corporate takeovers. If the story of the workers in Minnesota resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Have you witnessed this kind of industrial tragedy unfold in your own community? Let us know, and we will see you in the next documentary.